Thank you for asking me to come. I've prepared some slides. You'll probably think visually they're absolutely awful because you know how to design them much better than me, but forgive me for that. Can I just ask before we start, how many of you have known somebody who's committed suicide? Right, quite a few of you, yeah. And do you see a distinction between that and assisted suicide? Yeah, yes, I do as well. I mean, I'm a physician and I work in the cancer centre in Cardiff in South Wales, which is just down the road from Bridgend, where we had a spate of young people's suicides, and actually I've been very involved too in being concerned about the kind of copycat suicides that you see through the internet and some of the internet suicide promotion sites. And we had a vote last night in the House of Lords, which unfortunately was lost, where we've been trying to look at if there are ways of bringing controls on access to some of these encouraging and inappropriate sites. And I should state as an interest too that I had my own flatmate many years ago when I was a student, left our flat but then committed suicide. I think it is something that's completely devastating because it leaves one with all those questions about was there something else that one could have done, and it leaves a very difficult impact afterwards, even many years later. There's a sense of guilt and culpability, I think, in those that are left behind. I don't know whether that resonates with those of you who've experienced someone who's committed suicide, but a sense of, was there something I could have done to intervene? Was there a way I could have prevented this or whatever? Baroness Finlay's spoken to you this morning. Let me just get rid of one myth straight away. I don't think hospice funds are going to dry up. I don't know where she's got that from. I mean, people want to be looked after, and thank goodness we do have people who are generous enough to give their time and funding to hospices, which are really have been trying very, very hard to change attitudes towards death and dying, to say that death is part of life, help people to have quality of life for as long as they live, but accept that they are dying. And what's been quite interesting has been to see that when you have good care and support of patients, not only do they live better, all their quality of life indicators and their reported quality of life is better, but strangely they live longer. And probably because they're not becoming exhausted by being worn down and depressed, and because they feel confident in being supported. So if you like, the aim of what we're doing all the time with people for whom death seems inevitable is, rather than slowly drifting down, is to try to hold things up for as long as we can, knowing that when they do decline, it will probably be shorter, but they will be completely supported during that time whenever it comes. Now I want to tell you about two real stories, real patients, okay? Because we're talking about people in this world, not theoretical, not all this stuff about what you write down on paper. David was 36 when I was asked to see him. I had a phone call in the afternoon. Would I go to see David? He was married, his wife had just had a baby, a boy. Those of you familiar with family trees will realise this squares are men and the circles are women. He also had an 8-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter. And the GP referring him said to me, he's got a spinal tumour. The GP, the surgeon who'd operated on him, the oncologist who had given him radiotherapy, all thought that he would be dead in 3 months. He had severe pain. He was desperate for somebody to give him something to end his life. He was becoming paraplegic, couldn't bear the thought of being unable to walk, and his house was down a very steep drive, a very steep hill, which would make it very difficult to manoeuvre, particularly as his wife had just had a baby, and he was worried about how she would cope and being a burden on the family. So I went out that night because it sounded like a crisis, and I got there at 7 in the evening. I was there till gone 11 that evening. And at the end of the time, I agreed. I thought that he was going to be dead within 3 months. It was a really tense, difficult situation with a lot of distress. The oldest child, the daughter, was upset and completely aware of what was happening, as was the little boy, and his wife had obviously just had a new baby. And I spent a lot of time with him, and he wasn't at times always that easy to look after. But I will return to him and what happened to him later. Just hang on to him in your head. I hope I've painted enough of a picture. Lived in an immaculate home, beautifully kept, beautifully maintained children, and a stunningly beautiful wife. And he had total pain. He had real physical pain from his spinal tumour that was making him paraplegic. He had emotional pain, just the baby was just born, his world was tumbling around him, and he was really grieving for everything that he was losing. He was desperately worried about the family and the future, and he had all of those, why me? What have I done to deserve this? Why has this happened to me? So a degree as well of distress. Why has this been delivered on me, this death sentence of a spinal tumour, when I have everything to live for and I'm supporting my family? Now, the word dignity you've already heard. I think the best definition I've come across was one from Cicely Saunders, which is that dignity is having a sense of personal worth. Dignity isn't about whether you are continent or incontinent. Take people who are paraplegic, wheelchair dependent. They need help with toileting all the time. It doesn't make them any less of a person. It doesn't make them any less dignified. Somebody who needs to be fed is no less dignified than those of you that can sit at a table and use a knife and fork. Somebody who is disabled and has no use of their hands but needs assistance with feeding is no less dignified than anybody else. Dignity is partly an internal construct, but it comes from the way that people behave towards you. Are you of worth? Are you of value? Baroness Campbell, and she's referred to in your handout background reading, is a profoundly disabled peer. She's just about quadriplegic, in other words, all 4 limbs don't work. She has minimal movement in her hands. She needs assistance with everything. She's probably done more for disability rights in this country than anybody else. She's in the House of Lords. She's on a ventilator quite a lot of the time, a portable ventilator on her wheelchair. She comes into the chamber. It's quite interesting to see the reaction of some people who can't cope with the tubes. You know, you can see that they find it difficult to see her with a ventilator tube. She'll respond. She's made up. She has her hair done. She gets dressed. She has her projects that she is passionate about around disability rights. But the fact that she needs help with toileting and so on doesn't make her any less of a woman. She's married, and she and her husband have a lovely home. Oh, sorry. I want to go back home. Now, Harvey. Let's see if I can get back to it. There we are. Harvey Chochnoff did some interesting work that shows that the way that people have care determines whether they feel they have dignity. If you treat somebody like a lump of meat, then they will feel that they have no worth, if you treat them as worthless. Indeed, things like shaving people's heads, taking them out of their own clothes, putting them all in uniform, are used as ways of stripping people of their dignity in prisons and so on. You know, going back to the Second World War, the Nazis shaved everybody's hair off as a way of stripping people of their sense of personal worth and dignity, as a sense of control. Now that light is a bit irritating, isn't it?
Yes.
Anyway, we'll carry on. The other thing I just want you to think about briefly in all of this is the children, and I referred to the children already in David's family, but just think about children. How many of you have lost somebody close to you? Right, can you put your hands up? Yeah, so it's actually well over half of you. And it's really important to remember that in our society, when somebody dies, there are lots of other people affected. We are not islands. The way that one person behaves is affected by others. I met a family where the woman went off to Dignitas, and her son has never been able to recover from that or form relationships because he feels that his love for his mum was not enough to motivate her to stay alive. That he feels that he failed as a son, that somehow he didn't love his mum enough. And my experience, and I must have looked after about 25,000 people dying over the years now, is that children see past the body, the disfigurement, the disability, through to whoever the person is. They love their grandparent, even when they are old and wrinkled, because they love them. Children I've seen have patients with really nasty facial tumours, very severely disfigured. Their children look past that and are able to see the person inside and still love them. I've had young children who've wanted to help do mum's dressings because they want to be part of providing care for her. And those of you who've been with somebody really close who's ill probably can recall times when you could see the person behind what looked like a failing body and an outside. You don't love somebody any less because they're being sick, because something terrible has happened to them. And the number of children who are actually bereaved in society is really, really high. It's about 1 in 10 of all children. And actually the fact that over half of you have lost somebody really close just fits with those type of figures. So you can all identify with that. And I do think it's important that in all of these discussions and debates, we just remember what will be the effect, what is the effect on others, not other adults, not those who are older, but actually on children who are often not spoken to when they're bereaved, they're excluded, they may not even be involved in going to a funeral or whatever. From the Bridgend experience of suicide, which I agree with you, we need to think about differently to what's proposed with your performance bill. We've seen a lot of children deeply, deeply traumatised, whole schools traumatised by the suicide of one member of that community or school. So we're all interrelated. But the other patient I want to tell you about, to hold on, is at the other end of the scale. The old lady, widowed, I've had a good life, advanced cancer, unable to get out of bed, had pain on movement because she'd got a fractured pelvis, because she got deposit cancer in her pelvis. I just want to die. Just like David, completely compos mentis, not confused. I don't want to be a burden on my family, I just want to die. Angry that nobody would give her the means with which she could end her life there and then. So hang on to her as well as a kind of image of this old lady lying in bed, very pale, in a nightie, really unable to get even from bed to command. Not doing very well with that summary. For somebody like that, is ending her life when she feels that her suffering has come up, her quality of life is gone, is that the answer? Because that's what's being suggested, that you should say, okay, fine, here's your lethal drugs. Now, to take any decision at all, there are three things that we need. Just as when you apply to come here, for example, any decision you take, the person you decide to marry, the person you decide to go out with, you need information. You need to have information about what's happening, and factual information. None of you would have applied to come to art school here and been very pleased if you discovered that the building wasn't yet built, that the tutors weren't yet employed, and actually you were in a porter cabin out the back being taught by a bunch of workmen until they'd got around to employing some tutors. You'd have been pretty angry. You'd have felt misled. You need accurate information. You need to have capacity to make a decision. If you are confused or muddled, or you're giving misinformation, then you can't take a sound decision. And the other thing is, it must be voluntary. It must be devoid of pressure of any sort. If any of you felt pressurised to coming into art school because you really wanted to go and study English, you would probably go through your whole time at art school feeling really disgruntled and annoyed because you'll be pressurised into it. Perhaps you've got a really famous artist parent or something who thinks that you should follow in the family tradition, or with a bit more training you'd have better art skills or whatever. So you need those three things to make a sound decision, whoever you are, whatever the situation. So let's look at the information first of all. How accurate is information? Well, we know that most illnesses are incurable anyway, but the information around the course of illness is remarkably inaccurate, however hard we try to be accurate. And indeed, at post-mortem, if you go and do a post-mortem, you cut the body up and look inside, 1 in 20 of those, you find that the person didn't die of what's written on the death certificate. So I'm afraid medicine is not very good at accurate diagnosis. And it's quite common that with my own team, we have to go and say, hang on, what's going on here? This doesn't seem right. Let's go back, think again. What do we need to diagnose? What have we missed? So just because somebody has cancer and looks like they're really sick and they're dying, they may not be dying at all. They may have an infection, they may have a high calcium level, which will make them confused, and in fact people with a high calcium will look as if they're moribund. But it's eminently treatable, reversible within about 72 hours. You have to get the diagnosis right. What about the prognosis? What about the prediction of 6 months? Well, when I was on a select committee looking at this is a quote from somebody who is actually in favour of assisted dying, and he admitted medicine is a probabilistic art. And Lord Faulkner has admitted, well, we'll probably get it wrong some of the time. We can predict prognosis in 97% of people within about 1 or 2 days of death. In other words, when you think somebody's going to be dead in 1 or 2 days, 3% of the time you'd be wrong. And it happens to me. I'll say to the family, I think we should stay overnight. I really don't think they're going to get through the night. Next morning, the patient's sitting up in bed having breakfast, and the family are looking exhausted and saying to me, you said we should stay. I said, yeah, we'll stay tonight as well. You've had a nice night, haven't you, together? But, we're wrong. The other side is also wrong. Sometimes you think someone's going to live, and they're suddenly dead. But when we get into the realm of trying to predict by weeks, the margin of error can extend into years. You cannot predict prognosis. So there's a real problem in trying to say in law that you'll put a boundary around 6 months, because the law is black and white, and it's only a guess. What about capacity? Well, the capacity to make a decision looks simple, but actually we know that in Oregon, where they legalised assisted suicide, there was a very good study following 18 patients, to monitor them and monitor them for clinical depression, not just sadness depression, but clinical depression, which alters their thinking and perspective. Half of the 18 went on to have physician-assisted suicide, although all 18 had passed all the criteria to be eligible for it. And in that group of 9, 3 of them had a depression that had not been diagnosed and not treated by the team looking after them, which works out at 1 in 6 of people who have been screened and supposedly passed all the hurdles. And that's in Oregon, who pride themselves on doing it well. Oh, sorry, that's the data from the study. And the person who did the study is a woman called Ganzini. It was published in the British Medical Journal, and said the current practice of the Death with Dignity Act may not adequately protect all mentally ill patients. And I want you just to think about the consultation now, and remember those 2 patients, David and the elderly lady, both saying, I want to die, just give me something, I want to die. The way that I, as a doctor, respond to that will either steer the conversation to say, I'm going to do everything that I can to restore quality of life, or we'll go down the road as Baroness Warnock wants of saying, right, let's look at if you fulfil the eligibility criteria, let's go through, do the forms, etc., and we will book your appointment with death. We will say, Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, you will then get your lethal drugs. Tumbler full of a barbiturate, you knock it back, you'll probably be dead within 24 hours, but not always, because there have been some people who've woken up again in Oregon, but that's been kept very quiet by the press. But it's there if you go to the Oregon Health Department website. So in that consultation, where I'm a doctor opposite David, what I say influences what he feels, how I respond. So which road do I take him down? I would reflect back to say you really want to die. Listen, he's serious, you need to know what's going on. And it's the most incredibly valid expression of distress. But I may process that request. And in so doing, I'll give a subliminal message that I agree with you. I think you're right, that you'd be better off dead. I'm your doctor, you depend on me for information. You trust me because actually you have to. Sadly, just as if you're taken into A&E tonight because you've fallen off a bike or whatever, you will trust the staff there. You have to, you've got no choice. You have to trust them. So, I will be giving you a message that I agree, I'm going on with that. But if I go back and say, what is it that's making today so terrible? With David, his pain, his distress, his worry about the children, his worry about being a burden on his wife, the unsuitability of his housing, and so on. And I look at what can we do to improve today? How can I get you tonight having a better sleep tonight than last night, so that tomorrow when we have a conversation, you feel more able, less exhausted, for us to explore what you need. So what I did that night was I looked at what drugs they had in the house, what I could do to improve his pain relief. And it was a little bit of a juggling cocktail, but it was fine, and I thought, let's just get him a very good night's sleep. And I give a message when I do that. Oh, I need to go back. To say, you're worth me working hard for. I wouldn't stay there until 11 o'clock at night, leave my kids to get their own supper, because they were quite young at the time. can't get to music, sorry, I'm tied up with the clinical case. Skip your music lessons, etc. Because actually, he was more important than anything in front of me that day, because the distress was overwhelming. And that was my commitment to care towards a patient. And I would suggest to you that my duty of care was to intervene, to do everything in my power to improve his quality of life. But it would have been very, very easy to say, look, there's now 4 of us who believe he's going to be dead by Christmas, because it was the October. And actually, we should really just throw in the towel, just quietly stand back or whatever. I think to go off to Switzerland or whatever. So, it was in autumn 1991 that I had that night in David's house, and then weeks of looking after him after that. And as I said, the GP said, I'm only referring him because I cannot give him a lethal injection. He is the most clear-cut case for euthanasia that I have ever seen. It's a quote from the GP directly. And indeed, he fulfilled every criteria of every law that's been written anywhere in the world. But in 2002, 11 years later, he phoned me. His wife had just been diagnosed with a pancreatic cancer. She was then admitted to the hospice, and she died in the hospice, the same ward that he had been in 11 years previously. David now in a wheelchair at her side with those 3 children, and the little one, now 11, holding his mum's hand as she died. And the daughter said to me, Ilora, you thought Dad was going to die before, and on many occasions during those 11 years I thought he was going to die. And she said to me, you've always been wrong. And I said, yeah, I know. Sadly, with Mum, I think this time she really is going to die. And she did. And David is still alive now and says to me, don't go there. Just think what would have happened to my kids if you had agreed with my request. And he's spoken very openly about it. He did one article for the press, but sadly the press was so predatory that they camped outside his house, and he phoned me up after he'd done an article. It was for the Daily Mail, where various other press camped outside. And he couldn't get out of the house to go and get the kids from school. And I said, just get in your car, David, and drive towards them slowly, in first gear, and eventually they will move out of the way. And if you run over a camera, too bad, but don't run over a cameraman. Go and get the kids from school. And he did. But he's brought those children up on his own. His daughter got married a couple of years ago, just had a baby. So he's now gone. So there's a real difficulty in saying it's just the terminally ill, because his prognosis was certainly less than 6 months. And what's happened in Oregon? Well, Oregon's quoted as working really well. There has been a steady rise in the number of prescriptions issued for physician-assisted suicide, and a steady rise in the number of deaths. I've got the figures, but sorry, I haven't. All on the Oregon Health Department website if you want to look at them. And they've gone up further each year. So it's gone up nearly 5-fold. It's over 4.5-fold from where they started to where we are now. What's also interesting is to look at the length of time that patients have been alive from when they started to process their requests, because a lot of them are outside the 6 months, even though they've passed all the hurdles. So they're no better at predicting prognosis than we are. And Honora O'Neill, who is also in the House of Lords and is a philosopher, said, in an ideal world of wholly autonomous patients, wholly selfless and compassionate families and professionals, it might be safe. But we do not live in that world, and we should not put too much weight on the fragile structure of the voluntary, of those coercive influences. So I don't think it's a medical duty. I don't want doctors to be able, I don't want them to be licensed to give lethal drugs for their patients, because I want doctors to have to care. I want them to have to go back and care. I want them to have to fight the bureaucracy for their patients. I don't want them to find it easier to clear a crowded ward by giving it to somebody's request at face value. I don't want them to be able to say to a patient at home, I won't bother going and having a real fight with social services to get you more care and wood, because actually you're saying you want to be done. That's what will go on in people's minds, because it's easy. It is hard work providing care for people. If you're going in one direction, if one thing doesn't work, you try again. If that doesn't work, you try again. That's quite different to saying, right, Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, we'll book your appointment with death. And that's the decision that we're faced with. That's the lady who was in the hospital bed, desperate to die, 2.5 years after that time. She went home, she lived at home independently, loved going down to Waitrose with her neighbour to do some shopping, had friends come in, and after 4 years, she then was at home and died. And she said, this is a quote from her, when she was dying, that she was at the end of her life, in bed and unable to do but able to receive, and found an unexpected serenity in receiving. Fiercely independent, didn't want to be a burden, but over those 4 years she discovered that by letting people help her, letting neighbours come in, she was letting them do something for her. There is a giving in receiving, because we're all interrelated. And she described that fluctuant wish, her wish to die resurfaced, yet her ability to live resurfaced again. And what would be the consequences in Britain if we look on a population basis? Oregon, which has only physician-assisted suicide, it is not small numbers. As Baroness Finlay said, it is not. Oregon is a tiny state. When you look at the UK, you'd be talking about over 1,300 deaths a year by assisted suicide, because something changes in that relationship with doctors. But if you take the Dutch experience, where they have what Baroness Finlay wants, which is both physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, 1 in 34 of all deaths are from euthanasia now. And that would work out at 13,000 deaths a year. If you think of 13,000 corpses, it's a lot of bodies, a lot of people who would be going down that road if we went for both, which is what Baroness Finlay quite openly says that's what they really want. And the current bill is a way of finding a wedge through the door of Parliament to get it through in order to expand it later. Yeah, go on.
Just on these numbers, who are in the Netherlands?
Sorry, I wanted to make that go dark. Sorry. Yeah.
From the legislation in the Netherlands, you can only conduct euthanasia if the person is dying.
Yes.
So
No, that's not actually. That's not correct. In the Netherlands, they have to be seen by what's called a scan doctor as well as their own doctor. They have to be seen by 2 doctors. They have to be assessed. They have to say that their life has no quality. It's not worth living, and the law is now being extended to include children, but it also includes those with long-term chronic illness. So people like Dickinson, who Baroness Finlay was talking about, would be included within the Dutch law. I've spent some time in Holland, and it was a wonderful experience. I was as a visiting professor there. And what really struck me was the change in relationships, but also that it's a very different society to the UK. It's very, very different. It's a very pragmatic society. The way that people interrelate is quite different. And whilst outer appearances are exactly the same and we're all in Europe, and because they will speak English so well, it's almost deceptive that where the differences are. So it's a differently organised society. The other thing is that their own doctors in training tend to come from their own groups within society. So purely, I'm just going purely on the numbers and their legislation. The Belgians have just passed legislation for children, although speaking to Belgian doctors, they don't know of any children who've asked, but they do know of parents who have. Those with disability are indeed very worried, indeed, because they have to fight to get treated already. Baroness Campbell, who I told you about, has had a struggle to get doctors to treat her, and on several occasions people have been only too happy to give up on her. One time I was in Abergavenny, and those of you who know Wales know where Abergavenny is. It's heading up towards mid Wales, but inside Wales. I had a phone call to say she was admitted to St Thomas's Hospital, and her sister was worried that the doctors weren't going to pull out all the stops to treat her, even though she wanted to be treated, because they said she's now so disabled, isn't this the end of her life? And I said, don't worry, I'll get in the car. And I just got in the car and drove from Abergavenny to London, because I knew Jane wanted to be treated. There had been instances previously when even a doctor had said, no, she must be confused. She's telling us she's in the House of Lords. And her husband had to say, no, it's true. She is in the House of Lords. She's not confused. And he went and got a photograph of her induction into the House of Lords to prove that, yes, she is in the House of Lords. This is not, she's not confused.
I think what your talk brings up is there's an account of symbolic interactionism, which is that if men define things as real, they are real in their consequences. So what you're saying makes sense to me, that if somebody comes to you and says, I want to die, and you say fine, that you will inevitably create a message that's a problem. And that the work that addresses symbolic interaction is very different from the work on control. Because in crime, you're talking about that how can this resolve, in a living will.
Absolutely.
And that having been through a lot of death, I've actually changed what I think as it went on, because you engage with the people and it changes, the goalposts change. And that's what you're saying, isn't it? You're saying at the heart of this debate is this really crucial definition of what's real, and that people change their opinions.
I agree with you, and I think at the heart of this debate is public safety. It's about public safety.
I completely agree, but I also think, I've been reading that assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia, so I'm not talking about cases where the doctor gets rid of the patient, but when the patient has really expressed the will to die.
That's like both David and the old lady.
Yeah. And I've read that in some cases, well, in many countries, it already happens, although it's not regulated. And I was really interested with this argument that isn't it better to have it regulated rather than, not touch upon it, although it's already happening in some cases.
Okay. There have been some interesting studies, confidential studies of doctors asking whether they have actually quietly helped hasten death on people off or whatever. There is no evidence from the UK of euthanasia at all. And there is no evidence of physician-assisted suicide at all. There has been a suspicion that there may have sometimes been somebody like Shipman, who was actually a murderer, or somebody who deliberately overdosed patients. There is, though, a bit of a misconception around morphine in a lot of the world, in that it's actually very difficult to kill people with morphine if they've already been on it. So, in fact, in Holland, they abandoned an overdose of morphine as a way, when they took in their euthanasia law, because it doesn't work. Patients just had a good sleep and woke up again. There is, however, evidence from the same confidential inquiry in Holland and Belgium and the Benelux countries that there is far more euthanasia outside the law, and in fact in Belgium, who've changed their law, they estimate that only half of their euthanasias are actually within the framework of the law, and the rest of the time they're not. And part of it is that the doctors can't be bothered to go through the process and fill out the paperwork and so on. So there is something that's changing in the attitude between doctors and their patients, which means that death is, I think, in a way becoming viewed as a solution to a problem rather than the natural close of a life well lived. But the evidence is there that there is probably some under the radar everywhere, but from the UK it is probably less than in most other countries, and partly because we have such a strong regulatory framework for professional practice, and a requirement that you whistleblow on your colleagues, because if you don't, you'll get. We have to whistle. If we see bad practice, we have to whistleblow. If we don't whistleblow, our own registration's in jeopardy. That isn't the case in most other countries in the world.
Is your experience with Regent, which is young person's depression, suicide, also connected that if you send messages that suicide is okay at any point, it may have negative consequences?
Yeah, there is a thing called copycat suicide, which you see, and certainly you see that with groups where after one suicide you will get a higher risk of others, because that's kind of seen as the thing to do, and the pressures that come, and that's how the internet suicide sites work, when people get actually persuaded into it, because that seems to be a route to go. I think it's important to keep a distinction between suicide and what's being proposed as physician-assisted suicide, because nobody is suggesting that we should stop our suicide prevention policies. We have suicide prevention policies for people who are depressed, certainly for prisoners. They'll be in a room where there's nothing that they can hang a bootlace off to hang themselves. They'll be on suicide watch, all those kind of things. We take it very seriously if any of our authorities condone, encourage, or whatever, suicide. And yet here's the law saying, well, if you're going to be dead anyway, as Baroness Warnock said, well, why not speed it up? Just an amusing anecdote, really, on when we were doing the select committee, Lord Joffrey wanted to know if he could make his bill, which was a precursor to Faulkner's bill, more acceptable to Parliament. And somebody involved in the select committee said to him, well, yes, lengthen your period in which to reflect whether you really want this from 2 weeks, perhaps take it to 6 weeks or 3 months. And he said, oh, we couldn't possibly do that because they might have died in the meantime. He said, well, hang on, that's what they want anyway. So what's the problem? You mean you don't want them to die so that they can then have assisted suicide? It was very illogical. But it was an interesting reflection on the framing, I think, of the question in Lord Joffrey's mind. So you had your hand up, and
I think in the UK currently there's an issue elderly patients aren't given enough care or enough for operations. Does that come into the question against?
I think you're absolutely right, and it does. I mean, we keep on hearing about rationing. We keep on hearing there was a thing about elderly patients with cancer not accessing the treatment that they should have. And indeed, it is hard to access care for people, and they don't get treated as well, I'm afraid. And we've had scandals. I was involved in prosecuting a nursing home who were frankly abusing people who, they were young and old with severe learning difficulties, Down syndrome, and others who were frankly being abused within the nursing home, and I was involved, and we achieved prosecution of 2 nurses, and I think they had 4 years of nursing. Slightly nervous when I knew that they would come out, but nothing has happened to me so far.
Was the issue of neglect in that?
It was worse, that it was neglect. It was neglect and abuse. And trying to prove it, of course, was extremely difficult because they had profound learning difficulties, so were not able to express themselves. So it was a kind of complicated detective work, but it was pretty overwhelming. And there was another nursing home of the elderly that I was involved in helping the police over prosecuting for bad care, or lack of, we shouldn't even use the word care, because it was neglect, strict neglect and abuse. And that failed, the prosecution failed because we couldn't get enough hard evidence together. And the nursing home owner managed to be taken ill shortly before appearing in court, which meant that he was unable to appear in court. I was very cynical about how it happened, but you're right, and there is a real problem, and I worry too that if we change the frame, that's why those with disability are worried, that if we change the frame, they will be fighting even harder for equality. We've only just established equality, but it is really a veneer over the surface because the attitudes towards disability haven't changed. I've been fighting for many years to let people with physical disability into medicine, because there was a view that if they weren't fit and well, how would they manage their cardiac arrest or with procedures or various things. And for a long time I was arguing that it doesn't matter if they're wheelchair dependent, and have taken through medical school some students with severe disability who have been astounding doctors. One who became blind during her time in training, but with lots of argument we managed to persuade everyone to let her keep going. Another chap who broke his neck in a rugby accident, and who, after a lot of time, has managed to keep going. Another chap who came off a motor scooter and avulsed his arm. His arm got ripped off in the accident, so lost his right arm. An astoundingly good psychiatrist, not surprisingly, learned to do everything left-handed. But there is a problem. There is a real problem. We still live in a society that expects you to be young, beautiful, fit, etc. But don't forget Tanni Gray-Thompson, 7 gold medals. I mean, she's young, beautiful, unbelievably fit. I can't keep up with her going down a corridor. She's so fast in her wheelchair. She has had to fight to be treated. Go on. Try and condense them.
So, yeah, I will. So, the first one is about the two cases that you presented. First of all, I have to say that it's quite... I'm feeling almost quite happy to hear good cases rather than... because we've been through lots of examples of people dying, so the days when we have immersion talks are quite dense and dark. But you mentioned that you saw, if I may say so, 25,000 people dying, is that right?
Yeah.
So what?
I've been involved in their care. I haven't been standing at the bedside of 25,000. But I mean, basically, I've been in palliative medicine for 25 years, and on average, I've had about 1,000 referrals a year for support and advice.
So what?
And before that, I was a GP. Right, that's a smaller number.
So what, in your opinion, are the odds of being as successful as these two cases? So that, and also relates that with the Oregon study when you said that there were 18 patients involved in that study.
Yeah.
Is that a good number for a study when we can do a generalization out of it?
Okay, in terms of the study, what matters with the study is the research methodology. And the BMJ are pretty particular about having high quality studies that they look at. Basically, it was a very well conducted study, which was a qualitative research methodology. The methodology was sound. Okay, so you can have large numbers in a bad study, the results mean nothing. You can have small numbers in a very well conducted study, the results will be important. So numbers don't relate to the efficacy. Going to your question about outcomes, well, it depends what outcome you're looking for. You know, every one of you is going to die. How many of you think that you will be dead by the end of the year? How many of you think that you will be dead within 10 years? I've got really bad news for you. At least one of you will be, on the law of averages. How many of you think you'll be dead in 20 years? Yeah. I should put my hand up before as well, because I think I'll be dead in 10 years probably. Right, but again, you know, somebody's going to be joining her on that cold slab or in that mortuary fridge. Every single one of you is going to die. You've got to think about it now. You've got to think how many of you have made a will? Great. The rest of you might think, oh, I don't have any possessions, I don't have anything that matters. You do. How many of you got a bank account? Okay. How many of you have got any jewellery at all that's gold or silver? Okay. How many of you have got any possession worth more than about £200? Most of you, yeah. Well, if you die tomorrow, your family will have a real problem if you haven't let them know what you want done, because you will be dying intestate. They won't be able to access your bank accounts if you've got debts to pay off. They're going to be stuck for a time until it all processes through. Do they know whether you want to be buried or cremated? Do they know what you want at your funeral service? That's the reality. I told my family I want to be buried. I know where I want to be buried. It's a very soggy plot of land down by the Taff River in Llandaff, which is where I'm from. But so, you know, what's the outcome? The point I was trying to make with both of those patients is the complete unpredictability of what lies ahead. People think you go into a hospice, it's a one-way ticket. The hospice that I set up in Cardiff in 1987 was a converted nursing home. By the time we were 5 years in, we had a 50% discharge rate. 50% of people came in, thought to be dying, very distressed, lots of difficult symptoms. Half of them went home again, and the other half of them died. But if anybody dies in distress, not peacefully, I count that as a failure. I will sit down with my team and say, what did we do wrong? Why didn't we achieve what we could? Was there anything that we could have done? How do we learn from this? How do we make sure that we do everything we possibly can to make sure that people die peacefully with a sense of completion? There have been some patients who have said they could not face their last few days. There was a young man, and he'd actually been in fine art and was writing critiques, fine art critiques. And I ended up saying to him, look, you know, if you really would prefer to be sleepy, I'll give you something. You can put a syringe driver up and you're sleepy until you die. And each day I went in and saw him and checked that he was comfortable. And one day I said to him, do you want us to carry on with you being sleepy? Is that easier for you? And I said, okay, shall I turn this off? And you'd probably wake up a bit more within an hour or 2 hours. And he just nodded a bit. So he switched everything off, and I went back a couple of hours later and chatted to him, and he said, I just remembered something I wanted to do. I said, what was it? He said, oh, I wanted to write the last chapter of my book. Well, we didn't know he was writing a book. By then he was very weak, he was in bed, and I said, okay, so what's the easiest way for you to do it? So we agreed he could borrow my secretary, my medical secretary. He would dictate to her. She would record it, either shorthand or on a tape recorder, and type it up for him. He was wide awake, and he did this for several weeks. And then one day I went into his room, and he finished his chapter of his book, and it was typed out on his table. And with his girlfriend, we were looking out the window, and some kids outside were monkeying around and being quite naughty, vandalising a couple of trees. And we looked at them and laughed, both she and I, and we turned around and he was dead. And she said, I think he died now because he heard us laugh and realised that I was okay, and he'd finished his life's work. I count that as a good death. But I count it as bad that he was only in his 30s when he died, and that his tumour didn't respond to chemotherapy. But I want to achieve for everybody a good, peaceful death, but I accept death is an inevitability. I've looked after dying children. One little boy said to me, I know I'm dying. And he said, when I get to heaven, there was another little boy he knew with leukemia who had died, called Nosha. And he said, will I be able to play football in heaven with Nosha? I said, yeah, sure you will. He said, because I haven't been able to play football for months because of my leukemia. And we sat and spoke to his father, and I sat with him. And another little boy, aged 11, said to me, I'm going to die when my goldfish dies. This is a really bit full on. And I said to him, well, you know, what makes you think that? He was called Jamie. And he said, well, I know when my goldfish dies, I'm going to die. I said, no, I think your goldfish is really fit well, swimming around in the tank at the end of your bed. And so we went on. And I one day had a cardiac arrest call to the ward. And I ran up there thinking which child could have had an arrest. And I got there, and the nurses said, the goldfish is floating upside down in a goldfish bowl. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen someone trying to resuscitate a goldfish, but I tried really hard. I ran oxygen through the water. I thought, well, what do I do? I injected some steroids and some adrenaline into the water, and thinking, oh, come on, please, please swim. But the goldfish was dead. And Jamie died a few days later. He was absolutely right. But the one thing he achieved, his parents had had a very difficult relationship with quite a lot of physical violence between them, alcohol, probably some drugs, some cigarettes. Very split. And before he died, he asked his mother and his father to sit on each side of the bed. And I get emotional even when I relate it now. It's many years ago, and he got them to hold hands over the bed and said, "You will never argue again." I don't know what the outcome was, but actually I think that was as good a death as we could achieve for him.
I think that what your account has helped me understand a bit more is, I suppose, this difference between what I have previously called end-of-life management and depression, suicide. What you're saying, I think quite eloquently, is that a lot of people are fearful of being minded, and that actually if they have proper care, that actually their wish to die might change. Would that be a correct summary? And that it would be inappropriate to legislate?
I think it's normal, you know,
Yeah.
when you're told that you've got a devastating illness, that you are devastated. You grieve for the life that you thought that you would have. If any of you heard now that you've got a nasty tumour of some sort, you would be devastated, your friends would be, you would be grieving for the future that you had. If you had to have chemotherapy and you lose all your hair, particularly you girls with beautiful long hair, but possibly you guys as well who haven't yet gone bald, you would grieve for the woman that you view yourself as, and you would go through a period of feeling low and despair. But if you change the law to license doctors to give their patients lethal drugs, I think you jeopardise public safety. That's the bottom line.
Thank you very much.
Okay.